Mr. Maring, can you hear us?
Yes.
Thank you.
You ready?
Yes.
Somebody's up yet.
Okay, it being 6:30, I will call to order a regular meeting of the Oregon School District Board of Education. It is May 24th, 2021, and we are in person in the OHS Innovation Center at the high school. Katie, can you call the roll?
Ms. Bijak?
Here.
Ms. Garrison?
Here.
Mr. Maring?
Here.
Dr. Lakuta?
Here.
Mr. LeBrun?
Here.
Mr. Pankratz?
Here.
Ms. Flanagan?
Here. The board has a quorum, and I have received from Katie that this meeting has been duly noticed, so we are good there. On the agenda tonight, we have a consent calendar, some board meeting agenda minutes to approve. We have some resignations and retirements and some staff assignments, and then we have our normal reports and action items tonight include the approval of ESSER funds allocation and some of our unspent funds from our budget, and then some committee reports, and then our regular information items. So I will entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
I'll second.
It's been moved in second to approve the agenda. Katie, can you call the roll?
Ms. Garrison?
Yes.
Mr. LeBrun?
Yes.
Ms. Bijak?
Yes.
Mr. Maring?
Yes.
Dr. Lakuta?
Yes.
Mr. Pankratz?
Yes.
Ms. Flanagan?
Yes, motion carries. We do have an agenda. Next on the agenda is item A, consent calendar. As I mentioned, we do have quite a few minutes, so if you were not in attendance at those meetings, if you could let us know when you need to abstain from those, that would be great. We do have some resignations and retirements. So actually, I will entertain a motion to approve the consent calendar. I'll move it again. I'll second. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on the consent calendar?
I will abstain from the meeting minutes for 4/7.
Any other? Okay, Katie, can you call the roll?
Ms. Garrison?
Yes.
Dr. Lakuta?
Yes.
Ms. Bijak?
Yes.
Mr. Maring?
Yes.
Mr. LeBrun?
Yes.
Mr. Pankratz?
Yes.
Ms. Flanagan?
Yes. All right, thank you. Moving on to item B, information items. Katie, do you have anyone here from the public that would wish to address the board?
Nope.
Okay. Moving on to OEA report. Laura or Jason?
Actually, it's going to be Nathan tonight.
Okay, how about Nathan? The floor is yours.
So I'm Nathan Johnson. I am a member of the OEA Board of Directors as well as the OEA spokesperson. And tonight I just wanted to take a few minutes to reflect on the year that we've had. It's been a year full of challenging decisions and challenging approaches to figuring out where we need to go. And I'd like to say some thank yous. A thank you to the school board, to the district administration, to the staff of the Oregon School District, to the students of the Oregon School District, to the families of our students, and to the wider Oregon School District community as a whole. We've had a lot to work through this year, and it's amazing to be in a community that, regardless of what our approach is, that we all value our wonderful education that we provide our students. And we look forward to this summer and in the next school year, both getting a chance to bring back some of our time-tested, strong practices in bringing quality education to students, but also bringing forward some of our exciting new learnings out of this challenging year to keep moving forward and bringing the students of the Oregon School District the highest quality education that we can. So thank you to everybody involved. We're just about to the end line of this school year, and let's breathe a sigh of relief and keep looking forward to how we can continue then to move forward.
Thank you, Nathan. We appreciate your words. Next on the agenda is student report. I don't see Andrew or Chloe here. I think it's a busy last couple of weeks of school. As we came up, we had an OHS band concert going on. There's an athletic contest. I know prom was this weekend, so our kids are busy finishing out the school year. So we will move to C, action items. First item on the agenda is approval of allocation of ESSER funds. So I will turn it over to Dr. Bergstrom.
Hello, everyone. So this evening, we'll start off talking a little bit about the framework we utilize to propose decisions regarding the use of ESSER funds. And as a reminder, ESSER stands for, it's part of the CARES Act, and it stands for the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Program. And remember, there was ESSER 1, 2, and 3. And ESSER 1, we spent on Chromebooks very early in the pandemic. And so what we are discussing this evening is the allocation of the funding under ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. Now, the dependencies are still very much the same. So we're still waiting for the final amounts to be allocated. What we have showed you in your information that you received in the board packet and the information we'll discuss tonight is sort of the baseline expectation regarding ESSER funding. And we'll know more, and we really don't know exactly when we'll know more. As I had mentioned previously, the Joint Finance Committee is holding a session this week, actually, to begin discussions on this. As we looked through what DPI was recommending we examine related to ESSER funding, examined the needs of our students as we are coming to the end of this school year. We really decided on allocating the funding, or proposal to you to allocate the funding according to academic support, mental health and social emotional learning, support for multilingual learners, and then pandemic-related expenses. And because we strongly believe that it is the people in our system that make the difference for the students, it's a very position-dependent proposal, although the positions that you see on here would only be funded for 2 years using this funding. And after that, we would decide whether or not it was a position that was dependent only on the circumstances of recovering from the pandemic, or if there was adequate growth within our school district to be able to fund it. And Andy will talk a little bit more about all of that in his presentation in just a moment. So what we're proposing this evening is under the category of academic support, 1.0 FTE for an OHS academic engagement specialist. And this would be a person who would work with our this year's freshmen and some of this year's sophomores, because as I mentioned previously, we know from research that freshman year is pivotal in working toward graduation, and ensuring that students stay on track is extraordinarily important. And so after the pandemic, when we do have some students who aren't on track, we want to be able to allocate one specialist to work on engaging the students and their families and getting kids where they need to be so that they are graduating on time with their peers. So that's a 1.0 that would be for 2 years. We'd also like to add 1.0 FTE of K-8 math intervention. And you know that that was a part of our Table 2 in the staffing report that you saw back in March and again in April. And we know that we want to do that because we really want to work on the push-in model for intervention because of our desire to really establish a strong sense of community within the classrooms and ensure that all of the students have a strong sense of belonging. And we know that that model is going to take a little more than the 0.5 math allocation that each K through 6 school currently has. And then right now, middle school doesn't even have a math interventionist, and that's been on Table 2 for quite some time. So with that entire 1.0 allocation, we hope to be able to better meet the needs of our students in the upcoming years, anticipating that there would be some need for in-classroom support for learning. And then the next category is mental health and social emotional learning. You've already approved for the staffing report the addition of 2 social workers, and at the time we said we would utilize ESSER funding for those positions. Andy is going to present to you perhaps a different alternative for funding those 2 positions, but we put them on here because we've already said that that was important to us, and we're moving forward with filling those positions. Also, a couple of years ago, you approved a mental health coordinator position. And this position has been grant funded for 2 years in a row. And we've applied for the 3rd year of the grant funding, but we won't find out if we get that grant until September. Consequently, we would like to allocate that person's position or this position to ESSER, and then if we get the grant, we would move it out of ESSER funding. We just didn't want to find ourselves in a position where we didn't have the funds to support the mental health coordinator position. The next is support for multilingual learners. And as you know, there are some learners who are more vulnerable when they're not in class. I think that is a lot of our learners, but we know that our multilingual learners, especially the importance of being in person and language cues, etc. So we know that in the next year, we really want to be able to do a great job of supporting students, and many of them, it'll be the transition back to school. We also know that our bilingual numbers are rising at the high school. Consequently, we'd like to have a 1.0 FTE, 0.5 would be a bilingual position at the high school, paired, interestingly, with a 0.5 Spanish language position. So they'll have to be a uniquely certified person, because while the skill set of being able to be multilingual is the same, the licenses are different. And then we'd like to support the growing population of our multilingual learners at Forest Edge by either hiring a 0.5 bilingual or a full-time paraprofessional. And that's a decision that we haven't made yet because we're waiting to see how all of the needs appear. And then finally, pandemic-related expenses. And as I said earlier, or the last time we met, that would be Chromebooks, that would be personal protective equipment, classroom furniture, because so many of our classrooms had tables, and when you put 2 children at a table, they were too close together, so we had to move back to desks, and that required more desks, as you can imagine. We also did the facilitation of the medical working group and all kinds of other small things that we were able to charge very applicable costs to ESSER through pandemic-related expenses. So what we're asking you for this evening is we propose to you, we recommend to you that we take the use of, said very clearly in here, it is recommended the Board of Education approve the use of assigned fund balance for the 2 social worker positions previously authorized. Perhaps Andy will want to speak to that first. And ESSER funding for the math intervention and bilingual instructor positions. And it's further recommended that we also, for all of the positions other than social workers, and that the fund balance be assigned, or all of this be assigned for the next 2 years. 2 years of funding for the positions that we have presented to you. And did you want to talk a little bit about your thoughts on funding the social workers to something other than ESSER?
You bet. Yeah. I thought if we could step back a little bit and I could kind of share with you that, we have these ESSER different grants, and then we have fund balance. And to some degree, they're then kind of interwoven together, right? They're both used for the same kind of purposes to help us kind of get through through this year, but also potentially through the next couple of years. So I wanted to kind of just share, click on that, a little bit of background. So funds, there are a lot of different funds in school district, and some of you are more familiar with them than the past. But basically, we run out of a fund system. So we have our main funds, our general education fund, our special education fund, and they're woven together. And then what I wanted to talk a little bit about is fund balance, which if you're familiar with the accounting term, accounting formula, it's assets equals liabilities plus equity. Equity in our world, in governmental accounting, is actually fund balance. So you can kind of switch those out. So change the formula a little bit around assets minus liabilities would equal fund balance. So when we talk about fund balance, sometimes people get a little confused and they think it's just a savings account that a school district has. And for sure, it does have cash in it. That helps us kind of fund their year. But there are other types of components of fund balance in there too, because of the accounting formula. There are such things as land and inventory and those types of things that are not easily spendable. And that's where our policy 611 kind of comes into a little bit. It talks about different categories of fund balance that are out there. And our policy is basically taking those categories verbatim from the Department of Public Instruction's instructions. And it kind of goes through about, 5 different types of fund balance. The most restrictive is at the top of our policy, and that's non-spendable. That's the land and that type of thing that I talked about before. Restricted, there's external things like laws that limit what we can do there. We have to hold money back for bond payments, those types of things. Committed is actually the type of fund balance that the board, and only the board, can designate for a certain purpose. So it takes board action, and it actually takes 2 board actions to do that per your policy. The third is assigned fund balance, and that's kind of where I, as a business manager, live. And it's kind of restricted as to what I can do. And it actually also talks about having a group involved that doesn't exist anymore, which is the Financial Assets Committee. Typically, the board kind of acts on that assignment of fund balance when they approve the preliminary budget, because that actually happens before typically we submit to the Department of Public Instruction what our assigned fund balance is. So you act on that, but it might be good to revisit this policy since it has a committee in it that doesn't exist anymore. But it's limited to what I can do, and basically what it's been used for in the past is amounts that have not been spent, okay, for different purposes. A school budget might not be spent. Sometimes people call that, we tried to get away from the concept or the naming of it, but carryover from one fiscal year to the next. But that's what it is. And last year, we, kind of a little history lesson for everybody, we had quite a bit of unspent money because of the way the pandemic hit us. We had 1.5 million. At the time, I didn't know it was going to be quite that much. I was estimating about 1.2 to 1.3. Actually came in at 1.5 once all the books were closed. And we utilized those funds to kind of, because at the time, history lesson again, we didn't know about ESSER 2 or 3. ESSER 1 was out there, but we only got $100,000 from that. We also didn't know what was going to happen with food service. There are a lot of unknowns. So we kind of set that money aside. We have spent a good part of that money, about 1.1 million of that so far, for eligible ESSER expenses, majority of it. There's a little bit that's not eligible. So this is where the 2 concepts kind of meld together, because we might want to, and this is where Dr. Bergstrom was talking about, we might want to consider charging as many things as we can to the ESSER funds to free up fund balance that we can then, it doesn't have any strings on it. We can do what we want with it. And there's another point, and it's another concept, if you could push another button there. One more. That's basically the definition of assigned content. Categorical aid for special education. So this is an interesting concept. Basically, the school district, when I talked about Fund 10 and 27, those are the 2 funds. Funds that are charged to Fund 27 are either grant funds, and when you use something from a grant, which is mostly IDEA, which is a federal grant, you get a significant amount of money there. If you use federal money for something, they don't allow you to then apply for categorical reimbursement, which is a state revenue. So once you charge something to a federal money, federal funds, they're like, well, then there's no cost sharing involved. If you use your local funds, your taxpayer funds, they have a cost sharing thing for some expenses, mostly staffing related. Social worker is one of those things. We would be able to apply about 60% 50% of the expenses related to a social worker. Don't get too excited because I'm going to talk about proration next. We would be able to apply about 60% of the salary and benefits of the social worker to categorical aid from the state if we don't use federal dollars. Unfortunately, that amount is then prorated by 30%. So quick math, you're at about 18%, but that's still better than nothing, right? So we might want to utilize ESSER funds for expenses that we already have. We've already identified them. We know they fit into the ESSER categories. And then that would free up part of that most of that 1.1 million, depending on how much we want to do. And then use assigned fund balance over the next couple of years to charge the social worker. That would free up, we're estimating conservatively about $60,000 over the next 2 years, $30,000 a year. Also, if you've been following the governor's budget, that proration is actually a huge component of his budget process. He would like to take that from 30 to 50%. So then that becomes even more beneficial for us to consider. No promises that that's going to happen. There's obviously the state budget process is just starting, but I hear there's some openness relating to special education proration and maybe being able to fund that a little bit better than it has been in the past. So good concept there. Lastly, one of the things that keeps me up at night is these positions and just the nature of either fund balance, which is one-time in nature, or ESSER, regardless, is one-time in nature. That money source is going to go away eventually. I keep awake at night trying to figure out what happens at that point. One of the things that I had forgotten about during the pandemic, but came to me a couple weeks ago, was we actually have a debt payment that is within the revenue limit. You've heard me talking about it probably when I talked about the funds. We have this unfunded liability from the Wisconsin retirement system. Those payments are going to end in 2 years. So even though the ESSER funds are available for 3 years, actually a little bit past that, if we can line this up for 2 years, and then we can move some of the positions, if we continue to need them, into that, it's not really revenue, it just frees up revenue. So then there's a revenue source that hopefully can pay for those positions and continue them on for the future. So that was a lot to digest. I'm hoping or wanting to know if you have any questions.
So why don't we start with questions to Andy or Dr. Bergstrom about what we've heard? And why don't we start with our board treasurer, Troy?
I actually don't have any questions.
Okay. Kevin, how about you? Do you have any questions?
No questions. We discussed this topic at an earlier board meeting, so this further detail is helpful.
Heather?
Yeah, the only thing I was gonna ask was, in reading through this, did anything change from May 10th? In terms, it looks very similar, but I just wasn't sure if there was any tweaks or anything that,
No changes.
and I'm good.
Mary?
So, I know that you've mentioned that the amounts are not defined for ESSER 2 and 3. And I guess I'm asking you to look in your crystal ball.
Okay.
I mean, how comfortable do we feel with the estimates that are being thrown out?
So the dollar amounts that are in there vary because they're set by federal law. So the Joint Finance Committee can't lower those numbers. They can only increase them.
Got it. Okay.
And really, the Joint Finance Committee has set the formula for the ESSER 2. It's now that we just have to wait for the rest of the state and us to submit information to DPI to send it back to us. So I know it's going to be higher than that number, just don't know where it's going to be until September.
Okay. That helps. It's also really nice that you were able to find money to cover the majority of it.
Yep.
So, yeah, I think that's all.
Tim?
I have just a couple of questions for Dr. Bergstrom. The academic support role, the shortfall, the potential shortfall in credits, is that because freshmen and sophomores didn't sign up for enough credits? Or is it because they signed up for enough but didn't perform to a level that created this shortage?
There's a little bit of both.
Okay,
So remember that our percentage of students receiving a greater than F is similar to those in the past year, but it is a couple of percentage points higher.
Mhm.
So we do have some students who fall into that. And then there's also, they really worked to individualize, personalize the experience of every child so that if after first semester, which really was quarter one, remember how all this works. If there were students who were really not doing well, they customized the schedule to ensure success. And sometimes that meant decreasing the number of classes they had at once. So it was some students earned more Fs than in past years, and some students, because they didn't do well initially, ended up with slightly fewer classes. And then they were often more successful, but they didn't necessarily earn the same amount of credits they would have if they had been face-to-face learning.
got it. And I would imagine we have a predictable mechanism in place to help us with that support in a normal year.
We do. We have a program called Achieve.
Oh, yes, of course.
And so we would really be building another layer to
Mhm.
the Achieve program. And it also includes our students with IEPs and 504s too.
Okay. Were there particular areas where there was a shortage in credits?
Do you mean where more Fs than other
Yeah,
areas?
were there particular subjects or particular, was there just a concentration?
It was fairly even, my conversation with Mr. Planner, fairly evenly distributed. And where they found that there were slight bumps, and that's something that they worked on right away, as opposed to just waiting till the end of the year and noticing that. Something they were working on actively throughout.
Okay, got it. Thank you. The multilingual learners, is that going to be a floating role, a role that,
Well, the point five will be at the high school because
Okay.
they need it there. But then the other 0.5, it's either 0.5 teacher or 1.0 paraprofessional. We don't know yet. And
okay,
that will be at Forest Edge Elementary.
got it. All right. And then I have one question for Andy. Andy, the unfunded liability, the retirement system unfunded liability that's expiring in 2 years. How much is that a year today?
About $360,000.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to make sure I understood that. Great. And that's been built into our budget
It
for
has been,
a long time. We've gotten
this is the
used to.
Yeah, we're in the 18th year, we got 19 to 20, and then that's 20-year bonds are done.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thanks for the history lesson too.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
It's good for everybody. It's been a heck of a year.
Is that all, Tim?
That's it.
Okay, Anna.
Tim asked my questions, so thanks, Tim.
I'm good. Okay,
Can I
great.
ask one follow-up?
Sure.
Sorry. So, Leslie, you mentioned that it would require to hire one FTE bilingual teacher. It would require.
Or the equivalent of one FTE.
Right. Special cases, because it requires 2 licenses.
Oh, at the high school, it would be a 0.5 bilingual educator, and we'd also post it with a 0.5 Spanish language teacher. And we'd see if we could find one person who could fit the bill.
But if one person doesn't fit the bill,
Then we have 2
Two half-
half-time teachers.
okay, it doesn't substantially change the equation.
Not at all.
Okay, that was my question. Thank you.
Just a couple quick things. So with the addition of the 2 social workers, can you share with us what is the social worker allocation? How many social workers we have total in representation across the building?
You bet. So there is one social worker who's actually a half-time social worker, half-time AODA coordinator assigned to the high school. A full-time social worker assigned to the middle school. And then we will have 2 social workers assigned to K-6. And remember, just a few short years ago, we had no social workers. So we really increased the amount of support.
And just for the board, in terms of policy 611, that would be something that could be on the agenda for policy committee. And in terms of financial assets, just so people were aware, that was one of our board committees way back a few years ago. First year when I was on the board, I think we moved to just the 2 committees, policy and vision steering. So that's why this discussion is coming to the board and we're voting. So I'm not a huge hurry, but that might be something that policy wants to take up in the future with Andy's
I've made a note
consultation.
of it. Thank you.
And then thank you, Andy. There's a lot going on here, and to have somebody with your knowledge of public school finance and allows us to use these funds in the most effective and efficient and smart way. So thank you very much for your work on that. If there's nothing else, I will entertain a motion to approve. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, the motion on the, I lost my sheet, is to approve the use of unassigned fund balance for the 2 social worker positions previously authorized and ESSER funding for the math interventionist and bilingual instructor positions. And further recommended that the district allocate COVID expenses previously charged to district funds to ESSER to at a minimum allow fund balance to be assigned for the social worker expenses over the next 2 years. Is that the motion you make, Mary?
Other than it doesn't have the academic support.
Oh, sorry, did I not read the whole thing?
No,
Oh,
you
okay,
read it, it didn't have those words.
okay, oh, okay. Is there any further discussion on the motion? Katie, can you call the roll?
Ms. Lakuta, or Dr. Lakuta? Mr. Pankratz?
Yes.
Ms. Bijak?
Yes.
Ms. Garrison? Mr. Maring?
Yes.
Mr. LeBrun?
Yes.
Ms. Flanagan?
Yes, motion carries 7-0. Moving to C action item number 2, allocation of unspent funds for creating a larger blended learning center at Oregon High School and funds for the initial improvements to the Workwoods project.
I think that I'm going to hand this over to Mr. Lawrence.
All right,
We talked about fund balance and those types of things. I also mentioned that we allocated $1.5 million last year to COVID expenses, and we've only spent about 1.1. We're pretty well through the end of the year. So the idea is that we would be able to have a funding source by using the remaining portion of that money to basically take and remodel the unfinished area over by the new education instructional wing of the high school. So in here you have a little diagram that we've been working on with Mr. Kleiner and Ms. Schmidt from the online world. And we basically take and add a classroom, which is very similar to the other classrooms kind of in this wing, and it's right off of it. That will be used for math. It has a flow into a larger area kind of behind it, or basically behind it, I guess you'd say, that could be used in a lot of different ways. You see rows of desks right now, probably not how you would equip it for online instruction, but more individual learning areas, and then a couple private areas. One would serve as Jen's office, but also large enough that she would be able to work with individual students in there. And then also another private space so that if people are collaborating, that type of thing, there's a place for them to be able to do that. Double set of doors was important to kind of create a flow into this area so it doesn't feel kind of left off. But that was the main component to the blended learning center. And then we came up, well, let's stop and just ask if anybody has questions related to that.
does anybody have any questions in terms of the build out that Andy's explained so far? Kevin, anything?
Yeah, not on the actual build out itself, but maybe the process. I will wait to the end for that, or?
Okay, yeah, so this is just the build out.
Yeah.
Tim, go ahead.
So this was obviously set up for expansion in sometime in the future. It gave us at a very low cost room for expansion. And I would imagine everything we're doing here is easily repurposed. If we need the extra space for traditional classrooms,
Absolutely.
it could very easily be
The
repurposed.
one classroom that's there that you can see that's very defined.
Yes.
That is the exact, we actually drew out, there were 6 classrooms. 3 of them are in Oasis. So Oasis kind of occupies that area. If you cut those 3 in half, you have this other half. And there would be 3 in here as well as kind of an open space. So the classroom that you see there is actually one of those 3. And then as you move kind of to the east or to the right on a slide here, you'd see another classroom. It's a little bit odd shaped, but that's to get a door into there. And then the other one, you can almost see where the dividing line is there. You actually can see the dividing line. That would be the 3rd classroom. So you can see basically we're building one of the spaces. The other 2 are easily divisible. We're putting a couple walls in there to create offices. wouldn't have to be, it could stay there. They're not really impeding anything. The concept here is probably more than you want to know. But the concept is there's a second story that would go on this space. We actually have the floor already poured. It's the ceiling, or it's the roof of that space. Everything's been designed to go up a level. There would take some HVAC modifications and those types of things, but everything's been designed that way. And then the idea was the center area where those two offices are, and then that hallway, and then there's a comparable area on the other side, would be an open space to a two-story skylight, if you would. Because unfortunately, that one classroom we're building up has no direct sunlight. And one of our key components, even back in 2014, and with Forest Edge as well, is getting sunlight into spaces. So this was the way that we came up with trying to figure out how to do that. So it could stay this way completely, or if we wanted to open it up in order to kind of try to figure out how to get some natural light into there, we remove the offices, put some windows, and it'd be kind of a two-story skylight there.
Okay. You mentioned here that the cost is $375, and that is a conservative estimate. I just want to make sure I understand what conservative means. We could spend more, or we've over budgeted and we may have some left.
I talked again with Mr. Heitz today before I came here, and he said he felt very comfortable with being able to complete this work for $375.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Are
That's it
there
for
any
me.
other questions just on the basic build out before we get into the budget application? We'll have that discussion later, but any questions for Andy about the build out of this? And I just want to point out what you talked about, which was back in the 2014 referendum, this is the exact reason that we kind of shelled out this space, because we were kind of looking to the future about what would come. And so here we are 7 years later, right?
Yep.
Okay, back to you, Andy.
So then the second component to this is the Worth Woods safety improvements. And I think we've talked about this quite a bit with folks, but we have a couple of different issues there. One is just kind of that 5-acre parcel that we purchased, that was part of the purchase. It was used to be a prairie, actually, and it's got a lot of stuff that's kind of grown up in it. And we need to get in there and take care of what our old mink homes in there. And so, and then there's also an old barn in there. And the barn unfortunately had a tree fall on it this winter. And it made it a little bit less stable than it used to be, let's say, or at least it looks less stable. So we would like to, we got a proposal from somebody to basically get in there and kind of remove the trees and kind of, they're not good trees, and get them out of there, but also to remove the mink homes, which is kind of like lean-tos type of thing. And then the old farm building that's in there, and just remove all that material and get it out of there so that we don't have any concerns with that. In addition, the property on the other side, the west side of the property that we purchased, has an old paintball area that has pallets with nails and stuff like that in it. We'd like to remove those things as well. The funding sources for those three projects, I guess you would say, would be a couple-fold. One is the generous donation from the Zoc family. And then we have some property on the north side of the village of Oregon, or actually it's in the south side of the city of Pittsburgh, called the Donaldson property. And we rent that out for a farmer, basically grow crops. That rent payment is $20,000. I do need to check on that with Tim. We have received the $20,000 already. The lease actually ended last year, so I think the farmer just anticipated that it would be $20,000 and gave us the $20,000. We'll talk about that, but I know that I got at least $20,000. And then the other component is what you approved last board meeting, which is the $7,500 for the ETC easement and the herbicide application for the next 3 years. So we could combine those funds and have more than enough to be able to create these, do these safety improvements at Worth Woods, and actually still have some money left over for maybe the committee the ad hoc committee to kind of figure out what the next steps are for that property.
And Andy, that funding would also include the seeding of the prairie area after.
It could. I didn't include that in this, but by all means, we'd have enough money to do that. Mr. Zach actually covered more than 10,000 in the initial removal of the trees and all that stuff. But yeah, there was, I think, about $3,000 more for seeding and kind of tilling up the ground to put the seed in. So
All right, so go in reverse order this time. Any questions about the Worthwoods or any of the financial allocation of how we will pay for these things? I'll start with you, Anna.
No question.
Tim, anything additional?
Just as a reminder to everyone, our plan for that property does not include operating money. We are not digging into regular operating money, so having access to some of this one-time funding was important for getting this safety work done. So it came at just the right time for just the right projects, without having to dig into operating money, which is super helpful. So thank you, Andy.
Mary?
No question.
Heather?
My only question is the rental, the $20,000 money for the farm, what was that used for in the past, or what would have that gone
Great
for
question.
if it
So-
wasn't this?
We have sometimes people call these buckets, a budget bucket that I've managed that basically pays for any vehicle replacement, a large equipment replacement, copier replacement, all those types of things. And when we get one-time monies and that type of things, that's typically, it's not physically distributed the money, but I increase the budget there to kind of allow for those types of things to be able to happen, knowing that if the money is removed, we don't have to lay somebody off or anything like that. So that's where that money was. It was in this capital equipment plan. And just because of the year we had, it hadn't all been allocated yet. So it's free.
Kevin?
I might have missed it in the pre-read or didn't hear Andy, but the time frame for the learning center to be complete, is this something that'll be done before the next school year?
Haha, that is another question that we can't quite answer for you. We are told by the architects that we are 6 to 8 weeks out to go through the approval process from the state. We didn't anticipate that until, we learned about it about a week ago. We knew that there would be a process, but we're more used to about 4 weeks. And so this will be, it's going to be a little bit of a lottery whether we can get through there. The architect, in the past, there was actually a fee you could pay to go a little faster. We're not even sure that's being offered right now because they're so slammed with these applications. So the sooner that we can get this funding authorized, I told Mr. Heights that he would be sprinting tomorrow, assuming that this is authorized, to get things moving to the architects so that they can do their work. The drawings can be then produced to the state. Once he will then simultaneously, as we're waiting for state approval, be lining up contractors. This is not something that the state's not going to approve. It's just, we got to jump to them.
Just a formality that just is going to take longer because of the backlog.
Yep.
Yeah, I just wonder too, from a cost perspective, building this time is, not ideal. Coming from a guy that's trying to expand a house right now and won't have a garage till like November.
Yep. So the good news is we don't have any real wood in there, believe it or not. Most of it is steel studs and drywall.
Okay.
And then ceiling tile and flooring. So that's the majority of what we're talking about. But yeah, steel studs and those types of things are a little bit more expensive than we'd like.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Well, I've seen Zane out running in the morning, so actually he must be working up for that very reason, Andy.
There you
Sprint
go.
tomorrow morning. Troy, anything from you?
No questions, but I'm really excited about the blended learning lab build out. I think it's the first step in what's going to be, many more steps to come as we see more and more blended learning in our high school. So, and knowing that this configuration may not be the configuration that works for that classroom in 5 years, but it's a necessary first step, and we've got flexibility there. So, exciting stuff.
Yeah, and just to harken back to our last presentation from Mr. Kleiner and Jen Schmidt, prior to the pandemic, we already had 50% of our high schoolers that were already participating in blended learning over the last 10 years. And now that's only going to grow as we've headed through the pandemic and students are more used to this blended learning. So I agree with Troy that this will be wonderful. Anything else, Dr. Bergstrom or Andy? Okay, I will entertain a motion.
I'll move to approve the recommendation.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none. Katie, can you call the roll?
Mr. LeBrun,
Yes.
Mr. Pankratz,
Yes.
Ms. Bijak,
Yes.
Ms. Garrison,
Yes.
Mr. Maring,
Yes.
Dr. Lakuta,
Yes.
and Ms. Flanagan.
Yes, motion carries 7-0. You all can move forward. All right, moving on to D, discussion items. Let's move into committee reports. We're going to have a busy couple months ahead of us, so we will start with policy. Anna, your update.
Yes, a couple of things to update. First of all, Policy Committee does meet this week on Wednesday. Our meeting starts at 5:30 p.m. It will be, we will be hosting it in person in the OSD Innovation Center conference room. But you can also attend virtually. We'll have a virtual and in-person option, given that we have a following meeting on Wednesday as well. So that will be, that's up to you if you'd like to attend. We'll get the agenda posted and the Google Meet sent out. Beyond that, our committee did decide that we will be meeting regularly on the third Monday of each month from 5:30 to 7. And we do intend on holding those in a virtual format. So that will be the intent, really, to allow for more participation from all board members with how busy we all are and how many meetings we're going to. That's the goal with that one. So that is really all I have to update on policy at this time.
Great, thanks, Anna. Next, vision steering. Troy.
Nothing major to report except that we do have our meeting scheduled for next week, Tuesday, I believe. 5:30.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, and then we thought it would be nice for the board to hear, as well as the public, some semi-regular updates about the Worth Woods. So I will turn that over to Andy or Tim or both, or
I can start. So we have had, our committee has met a couple of times now in getting our planning started for Worth Woods. We have a number of things going with regards to the safety updates, the taking down of the mink farm and the barn and clearing the prairie area, the forest mowing, as well as the removal of the paintball area, all things we just talked about. And we actually have some field trips scheduled to take a look at some environmental and nature centers in the area to give us some insight around what could be done in the facility that we've purchased alongside of Worth Woods. So we have field trips scheduled for the Aldo Leopold Center on June 8th in the morning on June 8th, and the committee is planning to go to that, or most of the committee is planning to go on that field trip. And then we have a field trip up to the Dells to Upham Woods, a facility that our district has used in the past. And they recently built a brand new nature center there that they're literally moving into this month. And so we thought it would be helpful to gain the insight that they have poured into their new facility, so that we can kind of go to school on them a bit as we consider what the possibilities are for our environmental center at Worth Woods. So things are starting to gel, and we hope over the next several months that we gain enough insight and ideas that we can begin talking with folks who might help us architecturally, and then help us put together a budget so that we can begin to formulate a plan to go out and raise the money to create that environmental center and to develop the property in a way that's going to be used to the peak of its abilities there, both for all of the students in the Oregon School District and quite possibly beyond that. So I think it'll come together over the next several months. Certainly, Kevin, that's something we'll have ready for next school year, but you'll see progress each month for sure.
great, thank you. Any questions for Tim, since this is our first report on Worth Woods? Okay, just before we move on, I wanted to talk about board meetings. We've been together quite a bit in May. We've had actually 2 board meetings and 2 additional meetings with visioning and governance. And so Leslie and I have talked, we will have our regular meeting June 14th, but we will not have our second meeting in June on June 28th, because the month of June, we also have 2 committee meetings, a board meeting, a visioning session, and some things that we'll be talking about later tonight about the visioning session. Same with July, and then the admin team has a retreat that week as well. And then also in July, we will have our meeting on July 12th, but we will not meet on July 12th we will meet, we will not meet on July 26th. So I just also want to make sure though, for June 14th and July 12th, I know people take vacation, so I want to make sure we have a quorum. So please let me know pretty soon if you cannot make June 14th or July 12th, because I just want to make sure that we actually can have those meetings. And then I also want to make note that we also want to give some time off to our administrators. They have not had vacations in over a year. And so that's the purpose of that too, is we want to make sure our administrators can take some vacation time that they deserve this summer. So moving on to E, information items. Back to Dr. Bergstrom for visioning and strategic planning.
All right. So as was stated, we've spent some time together this month. And actually it started on April 29th. We've had 2 work sessions and the leadership team presentations. And a lot of that is really in service of furthering our visioning and strategic planning process. And just as a reminder to anyone who's watching this evening, the framework that you see is our draft framework, where of course we're driven by our mission and our values. And then there's a very defined role for the Board of Education, shared responsibilities, and the role of the administrators. Both groups, the administrators and the Board of Education, using a decision-making framework to ensure consistency in how we are approaching the making of decisions and what we are valuing as a school district. And all of this, of course, happens with continuous feedback from all of the stakeholders that are part of our system. And then across the side here, you see the various events that are helping inform us as we're moving through this process of visioning and strategic planning. So, as I said, thus far we've had our leadership team presentations, the board meeting where we spoke about the framework we'd be using for the ESSER funding, and that, of course, was approved tonight. The May 20th board workshop where we talked about developing a shared context so that we are all in the same place regarding an understanding of where we've been, so that we could move forward with that shared understanding. And then from June through September, we will be working on researching, collecting input, and basically the design process for Portrait of a Graduate. And a lot of that work will go to the visioning committee, but there'll also be a component for the policy committee. Because as we all know, policy 41102 is actually the written policy form of our current portrait. And we know that we want to do an update as far as what we expect out of an OSC graduate, or what we hope for an OSC graduate. So as part of that process, it's really about collecting input and feedback from the people who are most impacted by decisions we make, using that Portrait of a Graduate as our North Star. So we know that our staff, in the form of our leadership teams, they've given us input in the form of their presentations, but we will also be asked for feedback on any drafts that we have regarding Portrait of a Graduate, and for participation in the upcoming set of focus groups, which is really the next 2 pieces. We'll be sending a survey to our families in the within the next 2 weeks to ask our families for input related to what they would like to see as a characteristic or a skill or disposition for a graduate of the Oregon School District. And then we will also have focus groups that include community members, staff, caregivers of our students, and administrators and board members to come together in groups of 10 or 12, many groups of 10 or 12, to give input on this process. And then in the fall, we'll also be inviting students into the process through a survey, and also probably the vehicle of the Superintendent's Council will be another way to effectively collect input from our students. So all of this input and feedback will be collected and will feed into the design and development of the portrait. And what we're hoping for is an updated 41102 policy and a one-page infographic that really tells anybody who wants to know something about the Oregon School District, what we dream for, what we hope for our students, what we plan for, so that when they leave us, they are prepared for the world that awaits them. So there's a lot of input selection and dreaming this summer, and it's going to be exciting work for the district. Anything to mention there before we move into the next update?
Does anyone have any questions about visioning and strategic planning? I think it's really exciting that we have the different constituencies that are going to have an opportunity to weigh in. So thank you for the board members who really wanted to champion that feedback process. And I think we've gotten to a place where we are going to give everybody a really good opportunity to weigh in. And then before we come with the result, we'll go back and say, what are we not thinking of? What are we missing? So there'll be multiple opportunities for input and feedback. So thank you for those members who have who brought that up. So I think we're getting there.
All right, now we'll go to the teaching and learning update. So we have 5 things on our list today: the final weeks of the school year, our celebrations and events, summer semester, fall, and then action steps. So we know that Public Health Madison-Dane County, their latest order 16, ends on June 2nd. And so then the national, state, and local agencies are all continuing to recommend through the end of the school year the continuation of the safety protocols that have been in place, which include masking, distancing, hand washing, all of those things. They're continuing to be recommended by the CDC, DHS, and Public Health. Well, we'll continue with that through the end of the school year, certainly will, through graduation, and then we will be discussing summer school, and we'll get to that in just a moment. And we know how important it is to continue to follow the safety measures that have really worked well. We, thus far, have no evidence of transmission happening at school, and that's because we've been using really solid safety measures. And one of the biggest safety measures right now, of course, is to get vaccinated. And we are, thank you to Gina Joman, working with UW Health, where this is the 3rd time they've opened additional spots for us to ensure that we, our families who want to, can schedule appointments with them. You do not have to be a UW patient. You do not have to have sports insurance to be a part of this. And we sent out a couple of reminders to families so that if they are interested, they know how to get the vaccine for their 12-year-old young person and up. We know that Wednesday, June 2nd is an in-person or synchronous learning day, that our last full day of school is June 4th, and Sunday, June 13th, is the commencement ceremony, and that is pretty exciting. So we are hoping to be outside in Panther Stadium if weather is permitting. All graduate seniors will be together in one ceremony if we're able to have it outside, and how great is that? 4 guests per student, just to ensure there's 6 feet of distancing between households. And we will be requiring our students and our staff to wear a mask at that time. And of course, it'll be live streamed by OCA. If we have to bring it inside, then right now we're planning on 2 indoor ceremonies, but we may be able to do 1 if we can get enough distancing in our gym. So we're really all hoping for good weather, because it'll be so nice to be able to have everybody outside enjoying a really lovely day and a really special ceremony. And summer semester, there's nothing new from last time. We're really pleased that we are where we are, and we will be taking to you, and that's part of the action steps actually, so I'll get to that in a second. Fall, full days, 5 days per week. We kept it in here because it's really important to continue saying it. 5 days a week, full days. And we will be leveraging our online possibilities as soon as we know how many people are interested. And that's a part of the family survey that went out last week. The survey doesn't close until Friday. And at that point, we'll at least have an idea of the level of interest that's there and whether or not that would be something that we could provide or we would contract out, or what solutions we would have. So for our action steps, end of the year survey closes on May 28th. We are hiring staff for summer semester. June 14th, board presentation will include the summer semester safety requirements so that we can get all of that information to you. We have that in draft form, but we also know that the CDC is updating their guidance for schools in the next couple of weeks. So it will be important to take into account anything that the CDC has to say on the subject also. And then, of course, our Portrait of a Graduate input survey and the focus groups that we're hoping to hold on the evening of June 17th.
Does anyone have any questions of Dr. Bergstrom about any of the teaching and learning update? Kevin, I'll start with you. Anything?
No, all very clear. Thank you.
Anyone else have questions?
Did we get a copy of the family survey that went out last week? Could we just get it, just because I don't get it, I don't have any kids at home?
Absolutely.
I would just love to be able to see what went out in case somebody asked me about it.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
And then I think for the June 14th meeting, I think you're planning to give us kind of an update on the results. So we'll have that at that meeting too, I would think.
It'll be close. They
Okay.
said it will take 2 weeks.
Okay, either
So-
that or the next. Okay. And then one other thing too is, are you wanting board members at graduation this year?
Oh, we certainly.
Okay, so if people could email Katie and let her know and CC me if you're going to be able to be at graduation, so I have a sense and she has a sense of how many board members can be there, that would be great.
And for those who haven't been there, that means we're up on the stage shaking hands with every one of the graduates. So it's a,
Well, I'm not
Maybe
sure.
not.
Yeah, this year. We're gonna
Well-
nod.
Airhead.
oh, really?
Airhead.
Okay, well,
They give you up to comfort, perhaps.
all right. Well, it's a very valuable event. It's a very valuable event
It sure is.
for us as well as for the graduates.
So please just email Katie and myself if you could in the next week, that would be great. And you don't have to worry about what to wear because we wear gowns.
Although I would suggest some extra pins to keep your hat on if it's windy, because that can happen too. Oh, do you not, you don't wear
No,
hats?
we don't wear the cap.
Wow, that's good. I'll keep mine at home.
All right, moving on to medical working group update.
We had our last meeting on May 17th, and what a wonderful group that was. And we went around and asked them from their professional area of expertise what considerations that we should be thinking about for planning ahead to the fall. And we've got some great advice. And we also, really we formed some great relationships with the professionals in this group. A wonderful group of people who all had our students in mind and wanting the very best for them and wanting to keep the environment as safe as possible. So I can't say enough about the group who volunteered their time to help us out through this really challenging year. And for the equity update, after we move through the rundown of our equity initiatives, because remember it's many things, not one thing, that will lead to a more equitable environment. After that, I'm going to turn it over to John Cannon, who has an interesting study that he would like to share with you.
John, do you want me to log in? Do you want me to log into that one?
All right. Okay, good. Nope. Now I'm really good. I always know to start cautiously so I don't get that rock band reverb action going too bad. All right, so one of the aspects of equity is, obviously we want the goal of the school as a learning organization is to provide academic success, or at least that's the traditional role. There's a lot more roles that schools provide nowadays. But I thought this was an interesting thing to bring up. It is specifically about academic achievement and the role that some of our strategies can play in making that more equitable. So one of the things that we talked about before, when Darcy and I presented to you earlier, was the idea of doing acceleration versus remediation. This is something that has come into focus this last year because obviously there has been a lot of concern about students who missed some school in the spring of 2020, and there's been just a lot of chaos in the last year, if you hadn't noticed, with disruptions in schedules, limited time, limited face-to-face teacher contact. So what was really interesting is some new research came across my email over the weekend from the New Teacher Project, which is a source that we've gotten some very good information from in the past. So I wanted to share it with you because it actually has a very clear link to our equity initiatives, specifically about academic achievement and trying to close or eliminate the opportunity gaps that we see for students of color and students of low socioeconomic status. So to start with, I wanted to give sort of a reminder of the definitions of acceleration versus remediation. They're on here, but this is a great succinct one, and I'll just read it. Acceleration is using current grade level content and strategically building in concepts from previous grades that are needed for current grade level mastery. Now that is contrasted to remediation, which is saying, hey, you missed this last year. We're going to spend a bunch of time teaching what you missed last year before we go on to the new stuff. So different strategies. And one interesting thing that the New Teacher Project pointed out is that almost all teacher programs in universities teach that you should do remediation first before you get somebody up to that. And it kind of intuitively makes sense. In fact, when we first ran across this, I thought, oh yeah, we're probably going to identify all the things students missed, and we're going to teach them before we move on to the next year. But the research says, don't do that. That is a bad idea, because then people just get further and further behind. You never end up teaching the current grade level things if you're always teaching something from the previous year, and eventually that becomes a cumulative effect. So one interesting example of this that we have now is a study that was done, and actually there's a, well, this was a study that actually they were collecting data. So the National Teacher Project worked with ZERN, which is, it's a nonprofit organization that actually makes online math software. So a little caveat here, there is a company that has the product that kind of was involved in this, but I'm not endorsing the product. I'm just saying they had a bunch of data here because they had about 2 million students who were using their product all around the United States. And so they had a whole bunch of data points, and they've been collecting data for years that they've been using their product. So the data points that they used here was they took a look at all the students. Basically, they looked at grades 3, 4, and 5 and math. So they took a look at that particular group. And what they did, I have to explain a little bit about how the software works first, is that the software is one where you would often, I mean, this was used pre-pandemic. So it was used in classrooms with students who were, in person, but it was like one of those pieces of things where you can, a software where students could learn sort of independently online using electronic means. So they would get a lesson and they would do the math problems from the software. And if the student got the problem wrong or they didn't get the answer right, this program would try to teach it to them, like kind of to take its best guess at what they missed, and it would try to do some teaching about whatever the point was they missed. And then it would give them a similar problem using the same, where the student was expected to use the same skill. And then, if they got it right, great. Hey, you learned from that. That's great. It's really adaptive software, which is nice. If they got it wrong, it tried to do that again. It taught them, retaught the concept, and then gave them a third different problem. If they got that multiple times and they got wrong, then they were flagged. It was called a struggle alert. So the software sends a note to the teacher that says, hey, this kid is struggling with this concept. You need to go help them. So the struggle alert was what they kind of tracked, because obviously if you have a kid who's struggling, like Okay, software's not working, go get a teacher. So again, computers are not going to replace teachers, but they can kind of help because then the teacher can spend their time with that. The point here is that they had data from like 2 million students who were going through their lives before the pandemic, and they could track these struggle alerts. So the graph that's on here shows data starting in 2018, and then it shows that there were these struggle alerts that were kind of low like this, and then when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden there were a whole lot more struggles. So this data set is now down to like 50,000 students, and they were students who had already been struggling with math concepts or with these math concepts before the pandemic hit. Well, as the pandemic hit, all of them like had more problems. Obviously, there was some stuff involved, so they had a higher number of like struggle alerts. So then the New Teacher Project was working with all these teachers, and it said, hey, you've got all these kids who struggle, and there's this pandemic. Here's what we think you should do. We think you should do acceleration, not remediation, for the next school year. And then so they were like, this is what we recommend. Well, about half of the students, so about 28,000 said, no, we're just going to do it the old way. We're going to do remediation. We're going to go back and we're going to teach the stuff that we saw before we move on to the new stuff. The other group, which was about 22,000 students, their teacher said, yeah, okay, we're going to try this acceleration thing. So what they were able to do then is take a look at this data, granted only third through fifth math. But as you see on the chart, the black line is where they all kind of went up with some struggle. Then the point there is when they said, hey, we recommend you use acceleration rather than remediation. So the orange line was the classes that were remediated. And remember, up is bad in this case because this means more struggle alerts for kids. So the students who had the remediated approach actually had way more struggle points. It went quite a bit up. And the ones who had the learning acceleration, actually their struggle points went down. So that's a pretty good indication that this is a good approach. And you could kind of generalize, but we're going to stick to, I mean, this graph was only third through fifth grade math. So it works for everyone, which is really good news. The implications this has for equity are, there's actually two kind of direct links to this. One is that, I mean, first of all, for all students, the ones who had the learning acceleration, they struggled less when time went on. And they're also, they got to 27% more grade level classroom lessons in that year, which is great because that's the learning that they were supposed to do. So they got more of the current year learning than the ones who just remediated, who now have that gap that they're falling behind. What's really interesting here is students of color and students from low income backgrounds are just in general, they're much more likely than white, wealthier peers to experience remediation. The research is pretty clear on that just happens more often. We tend to have some internal implicit biases and other things like that that kind of influence people to say, well, I kind of, you know, we tend to just take students who are, you know, BIPOC students, low SES students and say, I bet you need some more help. And so we tend to remediate students more that way. And that's just kind of a national phenomenon, actually international. So that's one thing, is that those students tend to get remediated more. So by accelerating, we can actually, that actually becomes particularly effective for students who are non-white or who have low socioeconomic status, because they typically have gotten remediated more than they've gotten accelerated. So this is an example of one of the strategies that we kind of already adopted because of the research that was behind it. But this was an interesting, I guess, finding that said, wow, this is actually exceptionally effective or particularly effective when you're talking about trying to close those opportunity gaps, because you are now providing that acceleration to students who have traditionally been behind and traditionally not gotten that rigorous grade level content. So that's it. I just thought it was kind of an interesting tidbit about equity. So, but from an academic standpoint. Any questions about that?
Go first if people don't mind. So my first question is, the academic support position we just passed, are they going to be focusing on acceleration instead of remediation?
Yes.
Teachers at the high school, yes.
I mean, this is fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we're working to make all of our educators aware of this, and being aware is one thing, putting that into practice is another, but we're focusing on this and trying to keep on providing this kind of rationale to staff so that they know why we're asking them to do this, because it is counterintuitive. But yeah, that's what we're focusing
And I
on.
guess it would be helpful for us. Can you give us a real life example of remediation versus acceleration? So let's talk about a math class. Tell us what it looks like for a teacher to work on acceleration with the child instead of remediation.
Yeah, so I can actually give you, if you want, you can get this report, because I have actually a couple of examples in here. But one is, so if you use, like, if you, let's use so if you were going to do multiplication for a lesson, and you identify that, oh my gosh, last year, like, okay, so we're going to do third grade, and you say, okay, we're going to do like, we're going to talk about multiplication and division. In a remediation kind of standpoint, you'd be like, oh my gosh, these kids, they didn't ever get to, how do you do the addition and subtraction for two-digit addition and subtraction? Like, they never got to that. So how can you possibly expect them to move on toward, multiplication and division? So a remediation approach would say, okay, we're going to go back and we're going to teach second grade word problems to talk about like how to become fluent with word problems that have to do with breaking down like hundreds, tens, and ones into the subcomponents, and then doing addition to figure out that two-digit and three-digit thing. So, which is really important. That's good, but that's totally isolated from multiplication and division that they're supposed to be learning in third grade. So the contrast to that is that in order for a teacher to support the students if they're doing like the division that they're supposed to be learning in third grade, she'll say, okay, instead of going back and doing like this whole second grade thing with addition and subtraction with like 2- and 3-digit numbers, she'll say, okay, we're going to choose like a few days worth of lessons from last year in second grade that directly relate to this like, hundreds, tens, ones, place value. And we're going to be like starting off with the lessons from there so that they can look at like, what does it look like when you have these groupings? And so she can actually do like an array like process where you say, oh, well, here's how we like separate up hundreds, tens, ones, but we can do them in a way that like, if you say, okay, well, normally we would be adding or multiplying this, but we can break it up. So you basically have like, hey, 20 is the same thing as, 4 groups of 5. And then 100 is basically, you've got like 20 groups of 5. So you can show them how you can do the like basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can do that like 5 groups and that's 100, or 20 groups and that's 100. But you can show them the addition part of that and kind of use that second grade standard and then say, hey, this is 5 groups 20 times. That's your multiplication. Flip that around. You can take this whole 100, you can separate it up into 5 groups. You've got 20 in each. Or you can separate it up, into 20 groups. You've got 5 in each, and that's how they've kind of linked the addition and for 2- and 3-digit numbers back from second grade, but moving it right into the third grade standards, so that you're not doing it and then waiting a while before you get to how they apply it. You're kind of like saying, oh, we need this right now, so we're going to do the second grade lesson right into the third grade one.
You mentioned that children that were already struggling, they tended to struggle more. Is that what we've seen with our students, or did we have more students go into the struggling bucket? Or did we tend to see the paths go the same? If you're already struggling, as you head into the pandemic, they struggled more and other kids stayed here? I guess I'm just kind of looking for a sense of that.
Yeah, this graph is not our data. This is like, 50,000 students that weren't us. We don't have measurements that can really correlate this from a statistical standpoint. We can just pretty much go on anecdotal evidence at this point. So we are assuming that the national trends are probably true for us. We know anecdotally that a lot of students who struggled continue to struggle, or maybe struggled more with the pandemic, in that they didn't have as much in-person support. But once we ramped up the virtual support, in some cases it became a wash. In other cases, I mean, this is a small number, but it's important to note there are some kids who actually thrived in the online environment, and that's why we're trying to keep that for some of them. So I don't know that we can say statistically that we had that we're exactly the same, but there are enough correlations between the other research that the New Teacher Project data talks about with those millions of students in terms of like access to online resources, increased anxiety, things like that, that I think it's reasonable to expect that we probably had similar outcomes or similar effects. But I can't say that that's, I can't prove it with statistics, let's put it that way. So it's more of an anecdotal sense that we have from talking to students and their families and finding out, yeah, if you had really poor organizational skills and time management skills to begin with, and then you were a fourth grader and you had to go and work in a room with, well, heck, I'll use my students as an example because I had 3 at home during the pandemic. And at first they were all crowded around the same table and there was some distraction happening occasionally. So, we put desks in each of their rooms and, that helped. But if you don't have the opportunity to do that, and my kids have actually really good time management skills, but if you don't, and you don't have a parent who's available because they have to work outside the home, like you're probably not going to have some very good success at managing your own time and getting your stuff in time if you're not organized. So,
Other questions? I'll open up the floor. Whoever would like to. Heather, go ahead.
Piggyback on the data question for us, I realize this is a national piece, but will we have that every year with whether it's reading tests or math or that's an idea. Grade level, not individual, how many kids have a struggle life, but where we are compared to 2 years back.
yeah, we're working on that. We actually are just at the end of trying to get reading levels for all K-8 students. It actually, I want to say the testing window closed like yesterday. It's a little chaotic this year, and so it's not probably as comprehensive as a normal year, but we're doing our best to get it, and we should have the reading level for, I'll say all with an asterisk, almost all of the students like we would in a normal year pretty soon by the end of the year.
And the other question is, flipping the acceleration piece around reading time and the central standards that we've been talking about, is there an example like okay, maybe the argument that in second grade perhaps the positioning or whatever, the first part is the multiplication, maybe that's not a social example, it doesn't need to be taught until third grade when they put together anyway, or they're not that kind of, I guess I've been hearing a lot about how we pair that with real and things, and maybe it's not simple, but I guess I'm curious that if we start thinking about, well, if everybody in second grade is now which started it, the third grade is that okay, but that means room for other things, especially grade 100% or what we look at what is really necessary, especially in those younger years.
Yeah, this particular example, I think would not be an example of that, but there are some of those examples. One that I'll mention, and this is an N of 1, but I mentioned this last week at the meeting, but I'll repeat it for people who weren't there or for the camera. I was working with a teacher who thought that her students' reading scores were going down because she wasn't able to do the small group work, that she normally did. And in her mind, the small group work was really vital to having the kids, reading levels be where they needed to be. And she was shocked when she did the assessment at the end of the year. It was like, wow, they're really pretty close. And so she said for her, it was a wake up to say, oh, wow. So what I thought that real value happened for learning, that wasn't necessarily in that small group. That was in some of the other, either the large group instruction with a really good curriculum that's well thought through, that I'm teaching with fidelity, or it was in the individual conferring that I'm doing with students to give them feedback so that they can keep on moving on their level. So the takeaway, and this was just a very good teacher who's, you know, been around, has a lot of experience, and was very reflective, obviously, to see that. And that's not to say that that's the case for everyone. That was just one, so I can't generalize and say that should be the thing. Like, don't do small groups. We're not saying that at all. It's just that that's kind of an example of where she might say, well, there are still some benefits from small groups, but if we look at what's essential, she's like, I might spend a little less time doing that small group work for something else because that wasn't the thing that made the most difference. But I think in a lot of cases we're looking at, there's the essential standards and there's the supporting ones. And here's one thing that makes this really difficult is when you look at the flow chart of the standards and the supporting standards and the influencing standards, it's not like a flow chart that you can even visually see on a page. Like there's a website that has it and it's like one thing lights up like 15 others, and then upstream and downstream, there's just so much confluence of different concepts and different skills that influence each other that it's really hard to weave out like the one little thing. But there are some things that are sort of clearly like, oh, well, this is an interesting fact, but it's probably not an essential thing. From personal experience, my first teaching job was 4th grade in Illinois. And for some reason, one of the Illinois standards for social studies was students had to learn about the importance of bituminous coal. Illinois thing. Anyway, and I'm like, oh, we also celebrated Casimir Pulaski Day. We didn't have, people who worked in Chicago are like, yeah, Casimir Pulaski Day. So those would be probably an example of afterwards, I was always kicking myself. First year teacher, I remember being like, well, I got to teach bituminous coal. That would be an example of one of those where it's like, that's not essential. Like that may have been on the list, but that's like a nice answer to a trivia question, but that has not a lot of implications for further learning and success in life. So to the extent that we have some of those things, growing up in Wisconsin, I'm like, hey, I know that our state, tree is the maple and our state bird is the robin and our state flower is the wood violet and whatever. I think it's the robin. Anyway, that hasn't stopped me at all. So we still should learn about our state, but like if you're really focusing on the essentials, we'd probably want to focus on some of the higher leverage things rather than just recall. So those are things that a lot of teachers are having conversations on, and that they've done a great job on those Wednesdays when they've been able to collaborate to talk about that and say, okay, what push comes to shove, what can we pull back a little bit on, and then what's really important that it's less looking at things that like, oh, we can cut that. It's more like, okay, where do we want to really emphasize and spend our time to get to deeper thinking about things that are going to influence it later.
Any other questions for John? Mary?
Yeah, so is this, were you data collected in a larger class or something? So the acceleration be done in a full class, or was this more sponsored one-on-one? And so the question becomes, how do we, is this a professional development?
I do not know where that data is. I would have to, the methodology, this was like a pretty high level overview, so I'd have to go look at the methods behind it to find out. So I don't know the answer to that, but good question. As for professional development, this is not an easy change to undertake, but we've done a lot of the work for it in this past year by rethinking, basically we're not just going to do it the way we always have. It's looking at the essential standards. The challenge that we have now is working with teachers to say, hey, you have this pacing guide from last year, from 20 to 21, and we're going to move into 21, 22. We don't want to just say, hey, we'll take the same pacing guide and then just fit in like whatever else because we have more time. We have to continue to look at and say, okay, what are the things that we can strategically put in? Like, since we have more time because of the pacing guide, that's where we say, okay, what are the essential components from last year that might need to be reinforced before we move into that other part? So I don't know that it's professional development as much as it is giving teachers time to actually thoughtfully do that work. Although it does come into the whole idea of a curriculum map where you know what influences the next thing. And we have over 100 teachers signed up right now to spend 3 days in June. In spite of this year, we have 100 teachers who are going to spend 3 days in June working on, we're calling it the curriculum consolidation kickoff party, but basically it's like a step toward curriculum mapping, because after this year, we have tons of stuff, but it's all in Google Drives somewhere. And so we're going to bring it all together so that everybody has, I mean, it's not all in Google Drives, it's everywhere. Because a lot of the stuff that's been done over the year has been to say, okay, what do you have? What do you have? But we're going to pull all that together and give them time to actually look at that and start to develop some things. So it's not going to get done in 3 days, but we have a checklist of things that we want people to have at the end of this. And the end might be like a year from now. But it's like, we need to have a unit summary. We need to have, like at the high school, a syllabus, the list of the essential standards, a pacing guide, common formative assessments, summative assessments, that sort of thing, so that we have like not only something to give the new educators when they come in to say, hey, here's how you can teach this, but also to have it all listed so that you can make wise choices about, okay, these are the things that we really have to cover now. What are the strategic parts we can pull? So less PD, more just time to do it with that collaborative atmosphere.
All right, thank you. Very informative, John. Helps kind of get us thinking and learning about teaching and learning. All right, moving on to superintendent's report.
All right. May 12th, National School Nurses Day. So here are wonderful school nurses who've done a fantastic job for us this year. Becky, Raven, and Emily, hats off to you. And then, this was really cool, our graduate walk. So on Friday, after senior awards were given, which was another really nice event, the first time all the seniors had been together in one place. So that was a really great thing to see. And then after they ate lunch together outside, they got on 4 different buses and they went to Forest Edge, Brooklyn, Prairie View, and Netherwood, and did walks either through the school or outside because, you know, it seemed to be raining some places and not in others. But the kids were lined up in the hallways with signs and little homemade pom-poms, and they were doing all kinds of things to congratulate the seniors, other than yelling and screaming and shouting. It was a very calm but happy environment. I was really, really impressed with the kids. And then you'll see the picture on the bottom is just doubly cute because it's Miss Ebert's first grade classroom back when this group would have been in first grade.
Wow.
So as they walked down the hall of Prairie View, they were able to perhaps pick out their picture if Miss Ebert was their teacher. So it's nostalgic for the teachers, it's inspirational for the little kids, and I think it makes the older kids feel very appreciated. So it's a lovely event. I'm really glad it started, and we'll keep that tradition going. And speaking of traditions, prom of 2021 was Saturday night, and it was a delightful event. Everybody looked wonderful, and the outdoor. Many thanks to the OHS team, Brandy Husley, and all the administrators who made a parking lot special. You can see a giant tent, lights, sparkly flying things everywhere, roses, fake candles. I mean, it was really cool. And a really long red carpet with a photographer. And so I hope the kids felt special because that was the intent, is to give them a night that, while certainly not maybe what they expected a couple of years ago, I certainly hope it made them feel good and have a lasting memory. And then here comes Phoebe Jesky again, and it's a new award this time. Now she is one of our U.S. presidential scholars. Only one out of 161 students across the nation earned this award. So way to go, Phoebe. And then Wednesday night is OHS Virtual Honors Night. And you'll be able to see the recording, but if you catch it that evening as it's being opened up to the public, so many of our kids getting amazing awards, some financial, some not, but it's really a very special night that honors the hard work of our young scholars. And that's it for this evening.
Okay. Closing, future agenda, I think we have a couple things on there. June 14th, you said you want to bring summer school or summer semester safety requirements.
That's correct.
So we'll have that. If anybody else has any other thoughts about the agenda, please let myself know. And then we will move to checkout. Does anyone have anything for checkout? Mary?
No.
Heather? Troy?
Nothing.
Kevin?
No, except to say that graduate walk is super cool.
It was really cool. They did that the first year when Aaron graduated in 2019. I mean, if you haven't done that yet as a parent, it is so emotional to watch your kids. How did we get from this to this so fast? Anna?
I have nothing.
Tim?
Nothing.
Okay. I don't have anything either. So agenda item G is moving into closed session. We may or may not come back into open session. So we will not do a motion to adjourn, but I will entertain a motion to go into closed session to confer with legal counsel about joining mass action involving vaping pursuant to Wisconsin State Statute 19.851G. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Katie, can you call the roll?
Mr. Pankratz,
Yes.
Dr. Lakuta,
Yes.
Ms. Bijak,
Yes.
Ms. Garrison, Mr. Maring,
Yes.
Mr. LeBrun,
Yes.
Ms. Flanagan.
Yes, motion passes 7-0. We will move into closed session. Why don't we take about 5 minutes and then we will do that.